video, I will explain the eligibility requirements for a spousal sponsorship application, the documents needed for the application, the difference between inland and overseas spousal sponsorship applications, and much more. Before you can sponsor your spouse to Canada, there are many different factors that you should consider. Some factors include the eligibility to sponsor your spouse in Canada, what type of relationship you would be indicating on the application, as well as whether or not you would be sponsoring within Canada or outside of Canada. The most important factor to consider is whether or not you are eligible to sponsor your spouse in Canada. If not, then you would not be able to sponsor your spouse. Furthermore, it is also important to note that you must be married to your spouse prior to submitting a spousal sponsorship application. Lastly, you must determine whether your spouse will be in Canada while the application is being processed or will be outside of Canada. As previously mentioned, the most important factor to consider when applying for a spousal sponsorship application is whether you are eligible to apply. The reason being is because the sponsor must prove to Immigration Canada that they are financially able to support their spouse while in Canada. There are certain requirements that you must take into consideration prior to sponsoring your spouse. Therefore, the eligibility requirements for sponsoring your spouse are: you must be at least 18 years old, you must be a Canadian citizen or a permanent resident, you must prove that you have not received any social assistance from the Canadian government in the past or in the present, apart from disability. You must prove that you have sufficient income in order to support your spouse and provide them with basic needs. You must sign an undertaking and must ensure that you do not have any active undertakings. It is important to note that if you are a Canadian citizen living outside of Canada, you must prove to the immigration officer that you intend on living in Canada should your spouse gain permanent residency in Canada. Additionally, if you are a permanent resident living outside of Canada and would like to sponsor your spouse, unfortunately you may not be able to do so. You must live in Canada as a permanent resident in order to sponsor your spouse. With regards to spousal sponsorship applications, these can be one of the most difficult applications to complete on your own. There are many requirements and documentation that you must provide to Immigration Canada in order to prove the genuineness of your relationship. There have been many cases of fraudulent applications, and as a result, Immigration Canada has very strict guidelines for this type of application. Furthermore, by providing the sufficient information and documentation to immigration, this will essentially increase the chances of a successful application. In order to make your application as strong as possible, you should provide the following documents: photos of you and your spouse during your wedding ceremony, photos of you and your spouse during different times of your life and different events, proof of any events attended together, travel itineraries of trips taken to one another, receipts of any gifts given to one another, evidence of any joint documents such as bills, bank accounts, credit card accounts, etc. And lastly, any correspondence between the spouses. The most important evidence that you can provide to Immigration Canada is the correspondence between the two spouses. The reasoning behind this is to show continuous communication between the spouses and to show the context of the relationship. Examples of correspondence would be things such as love letters, emails, any chats such as WhatsApp, Facebook, etc. The more correspondence that you can provide Immigration Canada, the better the chances of a successful application. Furthermore, it is extremely important to note that this is especially the case for overseas spousal applications. The major difference between an inland spousal sponsorship application and an overseas spousal sponsorship application is essentially where the spouse is currently living. If the sponsored spouse is currently living outside of Canada, then they would apply for an overseas spousal sponsorship application. Whereas if they are currently living within Canada, then they would apply for an inland spousal sponsorship application. Of course, while they are in Canada, they must have proper authorization to stay in Canada. Furthermore, one disadvantage of the overseas spousal sponsorship application is that living with the spouse will be extremely difficult while the application is being processed. However, at that point, the sponsored spouse may be able to apply for a temporary resident visa in order to enter Canada. However, the temporary resident visa will not be guaranteed to be approved, and they still have to go through all of the eligibility requirements in order to apply. In contrast, the inland spousal sponsorship brings advantages to the sponsored spouse. While the sponsored spouse is currently living in Canada, they may be able to apply for an open spousal work permit while their application is being processed. An open spousal work permit allows them to work for any employer in Canada, anywhere in Canada, while their application is being processed. Therefore, if you wish to sponsor your spouse to Canada and you feel like you would be eligible, it is extremely important to consider all of the aforementioned information and documentation prior to applying. Here at Akrami & Associates, we work with many different immigration matters, and we have helped many of our clients be reunited with their spouses. If you feel like you'd be eligible, please contact us. With Akrami & Associates, there's always a way.